I was trying to think about who I wanted to win. Now, let's first of all talk about who I think will win. I've told you before, I think it'll be Barack Obama, and I think it's because of the way U.S. elections tend to shape up. And there's a Star Trek element to this. Surprise, surprise, for those of you who say you can generally time how long it takes for me to get to the subject of aliens, certainly in a history show, but even in the Common Sense show. There's, Star Trek red shirt guy number 2, in like every other American election. For those of you who aren't Star Trek followers, don't know what I'm talking about. There will always be, I'm talking about the original series, I'm too old to have followed any of the other things, but there will always be this moment where, okay, we've got to beam down to this scary, dangerous planet with all this unknown stuff that we don't know about. And I'm going to take Kirk, Spock, McCoy, Mr. Sulu, Scotty, and Ensign Rodgers. There'll always be some guy you've never heard of in a red shirt. He's the only guy who's not a regular member of the cast, and right then and there, Ensign Rodgers has had it. He's doomed. And in the American political, presidential election landscape, Ensign Rodgers is a guy like, Bob Dole or Walter Mondale. We see these people periodically in U.S. elections. John Kerry was an Ensign Rodgers. When they're nominated that person is not coming back from that election planet alive. He'll hardly get a mention in the afterwards credits, right? Go back to his agent and say, well, listen, I played Ensign Rodgers in that Star Trek, died in the first 30 minutes, but can you get me a gig based on that? How's John Kerry doing now? I guess he married into the Heinz ketchup fortune, so probably holding on, but that whole presidential run not looking good on his resume. You don't see him trotted out at these various Democratic National Conventions very often. Bob Dole either. Nonetheless, so we have the Ensign Rodgers, element in American politics. And Mitt Romney fits the Ensign Rodgers profile perfectly. Now, little bit of a twist to this whole thing, though, and that is the economic climate. Now, the model of, Americans voting their pocketbook, which, I was a poli-sci minor, and in political science they teach you that the Americans vote their pocketbook, which is a huge oversimplification. They sometimes vote their pocketbook. I mean, go back to the Great Depression. They still voted Franklin Roosevelt in for another term, even though 1936 was a horrific year in terms of economics. It depends on certain things. Normally, this year, President Obama should have been crushed. Conventional wisdom being what it was, if it played out the way it's supposed to every time, Barack Obama should not be within 8 points of the Republican challenger. There's a reason he is, though. And that's because, as we've told you before, the unique circumstances of the Ensign Rodgers Republican candidate pick. They pick a guy to run against the president who happens to be one of the few people you could actually grab who's from the group of people that most Americans see as the main force driving why we are in the situation we're in. Normally you want to blame the president. Say, that's the guy steering the ship. The ship just hit an iceberg. I blame the captain. The problem is the guy who was steering the iceberg, well, it's a guy like Mitt Romney, right? He represents the iceberg contingent of the U.S. economy. Do you want the captain who hit the iceberg, or do you want the guy who was steering the iceberg into the side of the ship estate? It's a tough call. Now, I think the fact that Mitt Romney's running as close as he appears to be is a sign of how much Americans kind of still want to vote their pocketbook. The problem is it's really tough to feel like the people that not only got you into this financial problem, the banksters, for lack of a better word, not only are going to fix it, but these are the guys who got bailed out. They hurt everybody. That's the perception anyway. And yet they themselves were saved. Because after all, they're too big to fail. And if they go down, there'll be a domino effect and everyone will be hurt. Well, everyone was hurt except the people at the beginning of the falling dominoes. So that becomes the wild card in why Mitt Romney isn't destroying Barack Obama right now. It was the same wild card, by the way, that helped Franklin Roosevelt in 1936. This idea that Franklin Roosevelt hadn't had enough time during the Great Depression to turn things around. And by the way, do you want to turn things around to the very people who, well, were running things in the U.S. presidential, political game when the house of cards came tumbling down? Today's show is brought to you by Audible. Please visit audiblepodcast.com/Dan Carlin for your free audiobook download.